Thank you very much. We're really happy to be participating in this session. This session is really important to talk about state infrastructure banks and how to fund our infrastructure. I think would be an important session pre-COVID because, as I was just mentioning in the green room, in 1980, about 80% of our infrastructure investment came from the federal government, 20% came from states and municipalities. Now it's about 70% from states and municipalities, only a 30% from the federal government. So there's a real role for a professional, high-performing state institution that funds infrastructure projects, and I think especially develops a pipeline of financeable projects and acts as a catalytic agent. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, then we'll start with Dave Zimmer, who's the CEO of the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank. Why don't we do that? Let's do that. We'll start with Dave, and if you could talk a little bit to the question, Dave, and what you see are opportunities and challenges in terms of infrastructure banks, that would be great.
Okay, good morning, Norm. Am I coming through loud and clear?
You're perfect.
Okay, so certainly thank you to you and GILA for hosting us today. I agree with you. This is an incredibly important, especially right now, an incredibly important topic. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that one of the main arrows in a quiver of trying to jumpstart an economy is through the infrastructure industry, right? So we really are kind of one of the pieces at the heart of this question about where do we go from here from COVID and how do we get back on track. I do believe that state infrastructure banks can absolutely play a critical role in facilitating infrastructure projects. And I'll go through just some of the roles that I think that we both either play right now or have the capacity to play. First of all, the obvious is we can be the conduit for financing and putting together the capital stack. And when you think about what types of projects, you've got public infrastructure projects that are typically owned and financed by state and local governments. State and local governments have the capacity to borrow through the very efficient municipal bond market. Okay, so if the demand is there, the supply is there, and yet we all know that there are billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in need in terms of roads, water, airports, etc., and they're not getting done. Okay, one of the ways that we could accomplish this is we need to provide cheaper funds to these entities, right? How do you provide cheaper funds? Well, you have to beat the rates that the municipal bond market offers, right? So you can either have the federal government provide additional funds to revolving loan programs like the Safe Drink, the Clean Water and the Drinking Water SRF programs. There are discounted loan programs that a number of the agencies offers, like on transportation, TIFIA, or on the water side, WIFIA, right? We should be expanding those programs. So again, just very high level, provide cheaper funds to the state and local governments to bring the cost of those projects down. If you've got large public infrastructure projects that are either too risky or size-wise too large and you're bringing in a third party, or conversely it's a private infrastructure, then again, you need to provide funds that are cheaper than the cost of capital for the owners of those properties, right? It's very simple math. This is not complicated stuff. Besides providing finance, we also can and do offer technical assistance, and we perform program reviews, right? So we can be that main entity that facilitates, because we do this day in and day out, right? And so again, really helping bring borrowers and prospective projects into the discussion, right? This is one of the main functions of an infrastructure bank. A third role that we could play, and we do play, compliance consultants. This is huge, and I'll tell you, one of the functions that we do, and we do very well, is when we have disasters and we bring FEMA funds into the state, working with our Office of Emergency Management, we have programs set up where we are the bridge, no pun intended, but the bridge conduit financing in advance of FEMA funds coming to our borrowers? Well, there's the Stafford Act, right? And there are all sorts of triggers that could trip people up and possibly cause those funds to be deobligated or rejected. So having somebody that understands the rules and regulations that the feds put on these programs, I think is paramount to bring in otherwise borrowers and project sponsors that would be afraid or timid to go into a federal program. A fourth role could be reporting. Anytime you get federal funds, right? There's a litany of reports that you need to do both during and after construction. And again, state infrastructure banks, this is one of our main lifts that we provide for our borrowers. And then lastly, and this is somewhat different, but there's a big education component that I think infrastructure banks can play in changing the narrative, right? So, and I can't tell you the number of local leaders that I get in front of and they say, you know, I can't afford the project. And they look at the cost of the debt service and say, we're going to have to raise taxes, and, you know, our borrowers are already overtaxed, or they're not going to really want to face this kind of tax increase. And my response to them is the cost of the debt service is not the cost of the project. You have to include the savings, whether it's the drop in O&M that you're going to get from lower energy costs when you replace a 50-year-old pump station, or the emergency repairs that you're going to save because you've swapped out a section of pipe that might have broken in another 24 months, and it cost you 300% more than if you had just replaced it under the normal course of action because you're rushing for just in time and freight and the production of the pipes, et cetera. So I do think we need to educate local leaders. We also have to educate the public, right, on what the true cost of this delivery is. So that to the extent that you're borrowing money and doing a project today, 5 years from now, your rates will actually be lower because you replaced that component in that infrastructure project before things got very expensive and out of whack, right? So I do think there's a narrative piece that we can assist and should be really kind of out front in terms of these projects make sense, and here's why. So yes, I agree wholeheartedly with you. We can play a central and critical role in facilitating the undertaking of critical infrastructure projects. And again, that to me is just a number of roles that infrastructure banks can and should play.
Yeah, that's what you said is really interesting because, you know, there's an emphasis piece here too, where we don't do a very good job of bringing private investment into our infrastructure. It's the education piece, right? Because it takes developers aren't used to that. They don't know how to think about that. They don't know how to structure projects. So all the stuff that you're talking about is actually much more intensive than you would imagine. Everybody wants a project to be finished and presented, and there's a huge amount of work. And then your other point, obviously, about compliance is a giant issue that nobody knows how to think about. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I love the comment. Okay, we just appropriated your funds. When are we going to see our projects done?
When do I get my water? So Lina, you're from the California Infrastructure Bank, so you don't actually have any issues at all in California. Everything's wonderful all the time, and everything that's not even useful because it's so easy to get stuff done in California.
Thank you, Norm. Well, so just a little introduction. The California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, iBank, you know, our primary goals, as David mentioned, are very similar: job creation, economic development statewide, and we do focus a lot on education and networking to educate municipalities and private entities about how to get financing. And here recently, back in January of this year, we saw a surplus in California of 5.6 billion. And then come May of 2019 with the pandemic, there was a swing of $60 billion where we saw a $54 billion deficit caused by the pandemic. So that budget was balanced with reserves, reductions, deferrals, and some governmental federal aid, about $10 billion. But there are other things that we have put in place to ensure that Californians, especially small businesses, are still able to function and stay afloat and get the help that they need. As David mentioned, we do have our own funds. We got some initial seed money from the state back in 1994. And since that time, we've actually issued our own bonds. We are AAA rated, so we try to pass those savings on to our borrowers. We do the revolving funds, which we use our money and then leverage for both direct loans and conduit bonds. But more recently, for economic recovery of California, we have allocated from the state $50 million specifically for COVID relief. It's the small business loan guarantees that have been given to over 600 loans provided to small businesses, which are focusing on disadvantaged communities and businesses that really need the help, that have access to capital access typically. And then recently, back in August, we were allocated another 25 million for the California Rebuilding Fund, again, especially focusing on economically disadvantaged and historically underserved areas. So those are a couple of things that have happened recently. But iBank in general, when I think about what's happened in the last couple of decades, we've got the Small Business Finance Center, which does the small business loan guarantees. They have issued over 470 small business loan guarantees. 1,000, over billions of dollars, with over 15,000 jobs created. And the other thing is we do fall under the Governor's Business Economic Development Office. And there are other initiatives that are in place right now to get access to PPE, personal protection equipment for small businesses, because without that, they cannot function or open. We've got Cal OES involved, the Office of Emergency Services, trying to make sure that small business impacted are getting the PPE equipment that they need. Another avenue is the governor's office. We have the California Competes Tax Credit Program, where millions of dollars are awarded to businesses that pledge to invest in job creation, with a focus again on economically disadvantaged communities. They've created over 22,000 jobs just here in the last 1 year. So those are some of the initiatives that we have in place. We also have the Jumpstart program, which is microloans, just $10,000 is the maximum. Minorities, women, for simple things like buying computer equipment or creating a business plan, getting some technical assistance. So these are all the different avenues that we're helping. Now, in the larger scale, we do conduit bonds, which is over 40 billion we've done so far. The Climate Catalyst Fund was just initiated back in the 2021 budget, and we're looking for funding. And as David mentioned and Norm just mentioned, private investment is actually very critical in some of these projects. And also we've seen that if the state invests some money, it gives confidence to the private investors. So it actually acts as a catalyst. So
Right.
that is something we are pursuing and trying to get. In my unit, the Origination unit, we manage the direct lending programs, the Infrastructure State Revolving Fund Program, and the Clean Center, which is energy and environmental needs. Infrastructure loans, especially right now with everything, with the impact of COVID, we are looking at it as a short-term obstacle right now with pandemic, because we're seeing states showing general fund revenues dropping 10, 20, 30, 40%. And these were historically strong credits. They are coming to us for water, sewer projects, airline terminals, roadways, LED streetlights, and projects like that. So we are looking at it differently. We look at projections. We're looking at historical cash flow. We look at balance sheet reserves, and also historically, how have they handled such disasters, though of course not at such a scale, probably fires, because in California that's a big issue. For example, recently we did one for Butte County, $12 million for a morgue facility, which if you were to look at the financials, it would be a little concerning because they do have a lot of fires in the last couple of years. They've had struggles and disasters, but they have always had excellent reserves and have planned very systematically. So that has really helped us do a lot of infrastructure loans, and we plan on continuing to do those.
So it sounds like both for you and for Dave, there's a huge increase in demand, right? I mean, that's what it
Yes,
sounds.
definitely a huge uptick. And we put some thought and wondered why that was. We thought there might be a little slowdown with the pandemic, but I think cities and municipalities out there are a little uncertain on what funds might be available during and after the pandemic. And so as long as funds are available and the decrease in revenues haven't quite hit their books yet, or we're not seeing those financials yet, maybe they're thinking, let's try to get some projects done. And so iBank itself, we just issue bonds every time we run out of money. So we never really run out of money. We ahead of time. In fact, today we have a board meeting where we are refunding some loans and issuing an additional 100 million, both taxable and tax exempt. So that's very critical. I find tax exempt is always busy, but lately we've found the need for taxable funds as well, because there's a lot of public-private partnerships in many of these projects. And with tax-exempt funds, there's some restrictions, as you know, that you can't really use it. So we are going and pursuing those avenues of funds as well.
Karin, that seems like a good area for you to jump in, unless Dave, you had some way to quantify the increase in demand.
No, so I just wanted to say, I think one of the things that we're also seeing is with rates at historic lows, despite the fact that there is certainly some pressure on municipal and county budgets, the financial folks recognize the historic opportunity for borrowing 30-year loans to get these projects done at levels that we may not see again for a long, long time. So in fact, our program, where we typically have done $400 to $500 million a year on the water side, in the next 12 months, we will end up hitting over $800 million in loans. In fact, we may actually top over $1 billion. So, certainly there's a credit issue there, but when you offset it with the opportunity and the opportunity cost, I do think, to your point, that we absolutely are seeing an increase in demand, which is a positive, obviously a positive trend.
That's great. Karin, that just seems like a great place for you to intervene.
Sure. Well, perhaps I could start with some context on who the Public Works Board is. I'm in the state of Washington, and the Public Works Board was created in legislation 35 years ago, and it was envisioned as a revolving loan fund for 6 types of infrastructure systems: roads and streets, bridges, sanitary sewer, domestic water, solid waste and recycling, stormwater, and wastewater. And in those 35 years now of our existence, it used to be where we would solicit a list from jurisdictions and they would submit their project lists to us, and we would rank them and rate them and award them funding. Our funding source is actually coming from 4 different pots of money. One is loan repayments. Ours is a RLF. It's a competitive program now. And so loan repayments are supposed to go back into the Public Works Assistance account that was created by the legislature back in 1985. Then we have the solid waste collection tax, public utility tax, and a portion of the real estate excise tax. And the way it works is that you have eligible applicants, which are cities and counties and public utility districts and special purpose districts. And the ones that can access the funding are ones that have authorized the collection of the REIT and that diversion over to the Public Works Assistance account for infrastructure. So you're sort of building a vested interest in keeping the system going. We had a 5-year drought where our financing from our account was actually diverted to other purposes by the legislature. And one of those big purposes was education, because there was a Supreme Court case that found that the state was underinvesting in education, and the Public Works Assistance account was sitting on a huge pile of money And it was very attractive and a really nice way to address a need without raising taxes or doing anything else. So in 2018, the legislature gave the board some bond money with which to do some infrastructure projects. In 2019, we requested, I think it was 250 million from Public Works Assistance account. We got 97 million. All of those dollars were invested. We had a pipeline after that of 250 million ready to go infrastructure projects. And by ready to go, I mean that they could be constructed in 1 to 4 years. We switched from having this loan list, is what we used to do, to a competitive application. And what that really did was spurred on readiness to proceed as a huge criteria, not just management of your system, but need. Readiness was huge. Some of the projects that we funded in 2019 have already finished. They've closed out their contracts. They are done. We were asked, because, along with everyone else, we started looking at what is our role with economic recovery in this COVID world. Because infrastructure is the backbone of economic recovery. And for many communities, it's the but for. But for this infrastructure investment, you cannot catalyze this kind of economic growth, this kind of protection to your environment, these kinds of health and safety measures for your communities. And so my team, when we're a staff of 9, and we have a 13-member board that are appointed by the governor, so that's the board part of PWB, went back and asked them, these jurisdictions, do you still need our funding? And the answer was yes. So we had that $250 million pipeline, and they said, hey, can we add some projects to the list, that we know are ready to go, that we need funding for? That list grew to 650 million. And that's just for the Public Works Board. Now, let me tell you that right now, our construction program has no funding to put out in loans right now. We are going to the legislature to request, or actually to the governor, we want to get in Governor Inslee's budget with a $130 million request from the Public Works Assistance account so we can address some of those ready to go projects, get that money out of the door now. We also have our newest infrastructure system is actually broadband. We just started that program in 2019. Broadband is huge for economic recovery and resilience of communities. It's important to education, health and safety, a whole bunch of different things. It's needed for businesses. Our broadband program, we did a planning cycle for 450,000. Then just on Friday, we awarded 17.2 million to only 7 projects. We had many more projects that met threshold, but we only had enough funding for 7. The interesting thing about our broadband program is that it's not just the cities and the counties and the special purpose districts and the PUDs that can apply. Our broadband program is eligible for tribal governments, internet service providers, ISPs can apply, not-for-profits, public ports. It's a totally different dynamic from our traditional program that we've been working for 35 years. And we had, the demand for our resource exceeded available dollars by 310%. So that just tells you what the huge need is there. We are asking to get into the governor's budget for an $80 million budget for our broadband program. And that would be capitalized from taxable bonds, not the Public Works Assistance account. We have the Public Works Assistance account, and there's a statewide broadband assistance account. And that broadband assistance account is intended not only for that revolving aspect of our loan dollars, even though broadband is loan and grant, but it's also meant to be a repository for any federal dollars that come in. And I would argue that for broadband, that it's a lot more than reconnect and some of the other traditional sources, that there are other programs like EDA, other congressional appropriations that could go into this account that then can be used as match for other things and to catalyze further development of broadband. So those are some of the things we are thinking about. We are asking the legislature too to end the sweeps and diversions from our account 2 years early. We know that this may not be the best political environment to do that, given the budgetary strains that the state is feeling because of the pandemic. However, we feel that if we don't bring this to the forefront now, it'll be really easy for them to extend the sweeps and diversions for another biennium past 2023. So I hope that sort of speaks to some of your question, Norm. But the demand for our resources is huge, and the competition for dollars is fierce.
Yeah, that's really interesting all the way around. You know, one of the things as I listened to you all speak, I realized that every one of you guys spends their whole lives trying to make other people's lives better, right? So we're sort of talking about the what, like this thing that we built, but in fact, what you do is you create capabilities for people to go about and get and have better lives, and
Yep.
that's really interesting. Infrastructure does a horrible job of expressing that fact, right? It's almost, you know, marketing without the sizzle, or, you know, marketing with two hands behind your back. That's a little rough. Zach, you just heard it. All the people have all the toys that you want. So can you describe a little bit about your reaction and what are your priorities in terms of setting up a Nevada State infrastructure bank? And then I want to do a quick round of people and get a sense of their ambition for next year in responding to COVID. But please go ahead, Zach. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. I'm Zach Conine. I have the honor of serving as the 23rd state treasurer of the great state of Nevada. And it's always really interesting to me to be on calls with folks who are a few steps ahead and have great advice about what they've seen work and not work in infrastructure banks. So I apologize in advance when my staff and I start blowing up your email with questions. But here's what we're trying to do in Nevada. We've been focused on infrastructure for quite some time. In the 30s, we built the Hoover Dam, and that created a little town we like to call Las Vegas. We encourage all of you to visit. And now we're trying to take something that was originally started in 2017. So in 2017, before I was in office, the legislature here in Nevada created a state infrastructure bank framework. And that was done in preparation for Infrastructure Week, which I believe we're all still waiting on. But the framework is there. And now we're taking the opportunity to use that framework and try to create something that can do some of the work that you all are doing around the country. COVID-19 has really shown us that there are some areas of infrastructure, whether it's traditional infrastructure, things like supply chain and how we're going to move products across the state quickly and safely, but also things like broadband and making sure that we've got connectivity for all of our students. And when you look at a place like Nevada, our economy is very dependent on basically discretionary spending, right? Sales taxes generated by tourists and residents, gaming taxes, hospitality taxes, and the rest. And so we need to figure out ways to diversify the economy, and we think the state infrastructure bank could be a way there. You know, historically, at least in Nevada, infrastructure spend has been very much a function of government, right? We've come up with projects, we put a list together, we issue bonds through our office to pay for them, and then we go about our merry way. We think there's a real opportunity in leveraging some of these public-private partnerships, really reevaluating how private industry and the state can work together, both to generate initial capital return to investors and to create the functions that we very much need. Additionally, coming out of a recession, you know, we had the Hoover Dam during the Great Depression, we had ARA during the last recession. We think this is an opportunity to put people back to work. Putting people back to work, of course, removes strain on social safety nets that are all very significantly strained during this time. And that's a real big focus of what we're doing. You know, we see effectively getting jobs back and creating new jobs, because some of the jobs that we lost during the pandemic just aren't going to come back, right? There are going to be jobs that are either automated away, there are going to be jobs in industries that just don't make sense for a period of time. So we want to make sure that this infrastructure bank can create those jobs, can access federal funding as it becomes available, and look towards private funding. And you know, we've been talking to Norm a lot about how we reinvigorate and reevaluate that P3 model to make sure it works for everyone else. And sort of our guiding stones at this point are, we see the role of the state to really serve as a clearinghouse for regional players. We've got some great counties and municipalities and cities in the state. Sometimes they talk with each other, sometimes they don't. And so being able to provide a central clearinghouse for projects, but also to make sure that those projects have access to feasibility studies and some economies of scale we think is really important. Dave mentioned this early on, but the ability to stack capital and to take different programs and put them together and make them clear to developers. I know that's work Lina does as well, to make them clear to developers, here are the tools available to you, right? Here's how to access the funds that you need in the order that you need them. To identify a priority list of projects, right? Projects that are going to help the most Nevadans as effectively as possible, put the most people back to work. And then find ways to decrease costs to investors, streamlining permits and approvals for priority projects, working with our local municipalities and cities to try and make sure that it's not a function of government being a little old or a little slow that's keeping these things off the ground, right? We know that there's a reluctance at times to work with the government because it falls into the too hard pile, and we're deeply trying to move it out of the too hard pile. We think that some of these innovative ideas can help to reduce dependence on a limited state base from a tax perspective to pay for these things. Again, in Nevada, we have no income tax in case you'd like to move here, but that does lead to not having as much money to pay for state bonds, right? We just don't have the revenue stream in a lot of times. So hopefully this can reduce our dependency on that base. We want to be able to fast track projects based on how many residents they help, how many jobs they create, and then ensure that private capital doesn't have to sit on the sidelines. We know that with what's happening in the municipal market in a lot of ways, while it's a great time to issue bonds, it's not a really great time to invest in bonds, and giving an opportunity for the private market something to do so that it's not staying on the sidelines, we think is a real opportunity that we want to try to capitalize on. But Norm, you just hit on this, I think, probably in the best way. The infrastructure bank is a tool, right? And I think we all love the concept and the idea, either because we've been working in them and having them be successful, or because we see what they can do for our state and its residents. But at the end here, what we're really looking for is, how do we make people's lives better? How do we make sure that Nevadans have more opportunity for their children than they had for themselves? And so if we can use this as a tool to help be the catalyst for that development, I think we'll be successful.
That's great, and super interesting. Again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time. What I find interesting, and maybe we can do a round robin or whoever wants to jump in, but you know, we're in a very strange period right now. COVID is simply has exacerbated the changes that we're going through. But one of them is the technology change, right? And technology is transforming everything about infrastructure. We had Jeff Eckel from Hannon Armstrong earlier, and you know, he's talking about all the innovative technology that transforms how buildings operate and the health of buildings, right? But that creates new businesses. Technology is going to transform everything about infrastructure, even the performance of brownfield projects going forward. And then the other thing that I just, you know, for some reason, you know, you guys have mentioned it, but I see it as being the only thing that happens in the future is dramatically increased private investment in infrastructure, especially coming from pension funds, because with all the debt this country has, despite what Larry Summers says about debt is wonderful. I mean, it's like talking to a guy from Argentina. It's not wonderful, and we have too much of it, and we're really going to have to come up with ways to get long-term private investment into infrastructure projects. And I just think that you're really what Zach highlighted a second ago, reducing costs for investment, probably makes a huge amount of sense, and it's a great role. Does that make sense to you guys? And maybe Dave, since he started and he's been patiently listening for a while.
You're muted.
We have to read your lips, Dave.
Sorry about that. I muted myself just in case there was any background noises. I didn't want to interrupt Lina, Karin, or Zach. So any investor, and this is pension or otherwise, if you're going to invest in infrastructure assets, you have two options. You can either do it on the debt side, you can do it on the equity side, right? If you do it on the debt side, and I'm the owner of that asset, the public is the owner of that asset, you don't have that additional cost for the equity return, that cost of capital, right? That's not what governments, we're not making money off of our local communities. If you bring in, on the other hand, if they come in on the equity side, All right, so now you're introducing a private cost of capital that needs to get returned, and you're transferring that cost onto your ratepayers. So just appreciate, right, that the cost of financing is going to go up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if that owner is now taking on the risk and taking it away from the local and the state government. But you need to understand that up front. So there is an awful lot of money in the pension area, and infrastructure, public infrastructure assets are a completely, almost unrelated class of assets that a pension fund will normally own. So from a diversification perspective, it does make a lot of sense for pension funds to look at investing in public infrastructure. But I think here's the catch, right? If they do take an equity ownership, and they go out and they hire an administrator and then the operator, since they're the owner of that, and it could be just the people that were always operating it, but there's two different approaches, and sometimes they're not necessarily in sync. You've got to optimize the long-term value of that asset, but you have to do it in a way where you're efficiently providing the required minimum service level to the public, and that's key, right? So you've got that objective, but at the same time, you've got this objective of efficiently managing that asset for the benefit of the pensioners, right? So are you just going to take all of the money out of the asset, and I'm being extreme here for a reason, take all the money out of that asset to pay dividends to your pensioners? You're going to gut the system, and you're not doing the long-term value of that asset any favor, and at the same time, you're really cheating the public on the service that they're supposed to get. So I think it's going to be very tricky for pension funds in terms of how they manage, almost in an art form, how they manage the if you will, the duality of these two objectives, so that at the end of the day, they're not looked at as just another private system that's coming in and taking over a public system, which of course there's a lot of resistance for that happening. And I think if a pension fund can figure out how to do that, that's the magic in the sauce, and they could be quite successful.
So the Canadian pension funds have figured out how to do that, right? I mean, that's what's fascinating, and they're doing it very well. Thank you very much. I guess they're up to, some of them are up to 17% and more in terms of investing in private infrastructure assets, which is fascinating. U.S. pension funds, not so much, but your point is well taken. And I think what's interesting, Dave, is that that's a great role for an infrastructure bank, isn't it? To mediate that and to drive performance both ways.
Absolutely. The administrator for the pension fund.
Yeah, there you go. That's interesting. So what do you think, Lina or Karin, about that comment? Because we're putting together the cookbook for Zach very quickly here.
Those are some really good points on the pension obligation funds. Talking about action items for next year and harnessing different sources of funds, of course, federal funds and state allocations are critical in this, because I think when that happens, private investors get motivated, and it really catalyzes them and gives them confidence to invest. Another very important infrastructure is green infrastructure. It's critical. In California, we've identified a little over $6 billion in infrastructure pipeline for projects like electric fleet cars, for municipalities, or zero net energy buildings, as Norm mentioned. Our Climate Catalyst Fund is really hoping and working to do some of those projects with private and federal funds. So that's something that we are really working on in this next year. And of course, continuing to focus on infrastructure, which is really, in many ways, my unit's bread and butter. As the treasurer mentioned, Zach, coming to government entities for financing, sometimes people have a block in their brains to think about that's going to be really hard. We have tried here at iBank to really expedite processes within our systems. For lack of a better way of explaining it, we've tried to be very much like a commercial bank out there. For a big municipality project, we can be out the door with an approval as soon as 30 to 45 days. So that, I think, is something that really helps some of these entities to come to us. Some processes throughout the state and throughout America, I think, in agencies can be very slow. It could take a year, or there's a lot of scoring and mechanisms like that. We don't really use any scoring mechanisms. It's a first come, first serve basis. So that, I think, also does help bring a lot of interest in iBank.
So before we go to Karin, it's really, for me, this is a fantastic conversation. You guys were talking about broadband earlier, which is something that's really, really important. One of the things I wanted to comment on, because I'm starting to get a sense that the focus on green infrastructure is almost like an old term, because it's a term that we've been using for 15 or 20 years, and it tends to stick in the craw of some people. And in fact, what the Chinese have started to call it is new technology, right? New infrastructure. Yep. We invest in new infrastructure. That
new proven technology, as they say.
No, not even proven technology, right?
Emerging.
5G, AI, et cetera, right? So anything where you put new technology on infrastructure, that's really interesting, because that kind of branding, at least in my world, makes a huge amount of sense. Karin, I know you guys up in the state of Washington are busy destroying your environment, so you wouldn't agree with what I just said.
Oh yeah. I think one of the strengths of the Public Works Board is that we can, with one loan, we can serve multiple systems. For example, if a jurisdiction is doing a road project, we can also help them with the stormwater culverts at the same time, and consider drawing conduit through at the same time. It's the dig once mentality. And so you're benefiting multiple systems, the environment, public safety, mobility, all at the same time. And you don't need to put in multiple applications, you just put in one. I think that kind of flexibility, especially when you're looking at rural and distressed communities where you have limited staff capacity to actually apply for and administer programs, making it easy for them and the customer service behind that is critically important. For us, it's really great when we can do a project that, like we did in Bremerton, that was a stormwater project that actually opened up access for salmon upstream. And that's really important for Puget Sound recovery and orca, because we have a lot of endangered species that we're dealing with. We also have the Centennial Accord, which is the co-management of the salmon resource with the tribes in our state, which is something I think unique in this country, to have that kind of co-management approach to a cultural resource, salmon, which is also an economic engine in our state too. I wanted to say too that while the board was very appreciative of when the legislature gave us bond dollars, and we were appreciative because the repayments of those bond dollars go into the Public Works Assistance account, that it still costs the state more money than if they were to fully capitalize and let our accounts flow through our program as they should. If they did that, we would not have to go in for decision packages requesting dollars. We would be virtually self-sustaining. And that's, I think, where we really want to get to. Layer caking different funding sources is really important, especially on complicated projects. Like some of you, we also offer tech teams, which are state and federal teams that come together to provide assistance to a local jurisdiction trying to work through a really complex, multifaceted project. And how are they going to get it to go? And how are they going to get it ready? We also do things called regional trainings, where we bring in resources. And sometimes it's training on workforce, and the fact that working in infrastructure at a wastewater facility is an excellent career, because we're dealing with the silver tsunami in infrastructure industries too. So that's some of the other stuff that we're thinking about. Before I forget, there was a thought that was niggling in my mind that I wanted to mention, and it just flew away. If we have time and I remember, I will come back to it. What I would like to say is that in addition to us, Norm, we have a legislature created something called SYNC, which intentionally brings together the State Department of Ecology, State Department of Health or Transportation Improvement Board, and the State Department of Commerce. And Commerce finances facilities. They have an economic development focus, an international trade focus, an energy focus. And so we're actually talking to them about what's the nexus between energy and energy efficiency of infrastructure systems, like your wastewater treatment facilities and things like that, as a way of promoting sustainability of operations, so that you are actually making facility improvements, increasing energy efficiency, and at the same time providing that essential service. And that's where we're trying to, how can we best collaborate across our silos so that the silos are much less apparent and that we're really there identifying the best solution for communities.
So that's very good. So I think we're actually 5 minutes over time. So either we can do a quick 30-second lightning round with each person, or or you guys can send me an email. Would you guys like to do a 30-second lightning round, or should we send emails about the recommendations for the next administration?
I can do 30 seconds.
Email.
I can do less. I got two concepts for any federal folks that are interested. If you're looking at helping jumpstart infrastructure projects, flexibility and cheap funds. Please avoid, any desire to add additional cross-cutters, et cetera, because the more that you add, the more process that you require, the more expensive, the more time, and therefore the less interest. And then obviously on the cheap fund side, expand revolving loan programs. Think about creating insurance programs so you don't have to do it on budget. Think of, a limited kind of Fannie Mae type. And then also with rates where they are, think about offering to buy down interest rates instead of providing principal.
Okay, that's great. Lina, you got 30 seconds.
I think more harnessing of federal funds and state funds, but I know WIFIA has a lot of outreach programs, and they reach out and talk in presentations and things, but I have not myself, going to many presentations, seen a lot of other federal programs out there advertising or marketing that I could learn about to see how I could harness those to maybe combine funds. So if there's a, let's say, $50 million project, some of it could be WIFIA or some of it could be some other federal program or state. So I think education is very critical as long as, people are looking for funds, and David had some excellent points. So I'll just piggyback off of him.
Super, that's very good. Karin. Karin. We've lost Karin. Zach, you have the final word.
You didn't lose me.
Thanks
I
so
just
much for
couldn't find my
having me
mic.
here today, and thanks so much. Did we get Karin?
Karin's back.
Okay, I'm back. I just will build on that. I mentioned already, we started working on this in the summer with great intent about if there was a next round of stimulus and it was infrastructure stimulus, what would we go for? And the whole sustainable infrastructure, which we included the green infrastructure and energy in that component. More dollars to invest in basic infrastructure systems because those have been underinvested for decades. Also, we were talking about the whole thing about workforce because that resonated across multiple states, that we've got an issue with the workforce of the future for infrastructure, and those are really good careers, and we should be helping promote that. And there were some other things too, but I will defer.
Very good. And Zach, you have the last word, and I really appreciate all of you all taking the time. These are great, and it's wonderful to have you guys.
Well, thanks for having us, Norm. I'm just going to second everything Dave said as far as flexibility and cost of capital. I think that's exceptionally important. And I think the one other thing I'd mention, especially for states like Nevada, who are newer to this place, is that often these federal funds are about plus-ups. They're about taking existing programs and adding additional money to them. And we'd certainly encourage all of our federal partners to look at states that don't currently have programs like that, just to make sure they get the funding that they need as well. But flexibility, additional funds, and giving us the timeline necessary to actually get them out the door, which I know is one of the big issues with a lot of the CARES funding. Again, thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the panel and learned a lot from y'all, so thank you.
This is great, and for all the listeners as well, and for the panelists, if you have any additional recommendations, I've taken notes. That would be fantastic. I just think, in any stimulus, and 90% of the infrastructure community, a recent survey we did, it's a little bit more than 90%, say there's going to be an infrastructure stimulus in the next administration, whether Republican or Democrat. We need to figure out what that should look like. So state infrastructure banks need to be a big part of that. So thank you very much, you guys. I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you guys in person one of these days, because that being in person again would be fantastic.
Thank you, Norm. I
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much.
Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.